Have you ever wondered how some of history's brightest stars navigated a world filled with traps and turmoil? Imagine living in an age of dazzling art and earth-shattering ideas, but also a time when one wrong move, one whispered rumor could destroy your life and legacy. What if choosing to walk a solitary path was the only way to protect your work, your reputation, or even your very life? Could a powerful queen really turn down Europe's most eligible kings, not for love, but to shield her entire nation from chaos? Is it possible that a genius artist, whose creations we still marvel at, lived a life of quiet seclusion partly to keep his controversial ideas and private life away from prying judgmental eyes? Think about a brilliant woman whose intellect was considered so unusual, so potentially scandalous for her time, that staying unmarried became her way of continuing her work unhindered. And what about the thinkers and reformers who saw corruption all around them? Did they choose a single, focused life to better fight for what they believed in, without being dragged into the very messes they were trying to expose? Get ready to explore the lives of 10 remarkable Renaissance figures who, in one way or another, found themselves on a path of singledom in an era where marriage was the norm and scandal lurked around every corner. Number 10. Filippo Brunelleschi, the architect, who guarded his genius like a fortress. Filippo Brunelleschi was a name that echoed through the streets of Florence, a city buzzing with artistic revolution. He was the mind that dared to solve one of the greatest architectural puzzles of his time: how to build the massive dome for Florence's cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore. This was not just a building project. It was a declaration of Florence's ambition, its ingenuity, its faith. Brunelleschi, born in 1377, was a goldsmith, a sculptor, and an inventor. But it was as an architect that he would leave an indelible mark on the world. He was known for his fierce determination, his innovative methods, and also for being incredibly secretive about his work. Filippo Brunelleschi never married. He dedicated his life almost entirely to his craft. His focus was legendary. Building the dome was an immense undertaking, fraught with technical challenges that had stumped others for decades. He invented new hoists and cranes, devised ingenious masonry techniques, and managed a massive workforce. This kind of intense, groundbreaking work demanded singular devotion. Marriage in the Renaissance, especially for a man of his rising status, would have come with significant social obligations, family responsibilities, and potential distractions. His time, his energy, and his mental space were consumed by the colossal task before him. The world of Renaissance Florence, while a hub of creativity, was also rife with intense rivalries and professional jealousies. Artists and architects competed fiercely for commissions, prestige, and the favor of wealthy patrons. Lorenzo Ghiberti, another celebrated artist, was Brunelleschi's lifelong rival. Their competition began famously with the contest for the commission of the bronze doors of the Florence Baptistery, which Ghiberti won. This rivalry continued throughout their careers, often intersecting with the cathedral project. Sharing his innovative techniques or plans prematurely could have meant seeing them stolen or undermined by competitors eager to seize glory or discredit him. A public scandal, whether personal or professional, could have easily derailed his complex and politically sensitive projects. Patrons might withdraw support, or city officials might lose confidence. His secretive nature, his insistence on controlling every aspect of the dome's construction, can be seen as a way to protect his revolutionary ideas from being diluted, copied, or sabotaged. He once famously feigned illness to demonstrate how indispensable he was to the dome project, when officials tried to make him work more closely with Ghiberti. Brunelleschi's approach to his work was all-consuming. He lived for his projects, most notably the dome, which took 16 years to complete from 1420 to 1436. There are few records detailing his private personal life, suggesting a man who channeled his passions into his creations. In an era where alliances, often sealed by marriage, were crucial for social and professional advancement, Brunelleschi's path was somewhat unusual for a layman of his stature. He found his security and legacy not in family ties, but in the monumental structures he brought into existence. His single-mindedness ensured that the dome, a marvel of engineering and a symbol of Renaissance innovation, reached completion. His choice to remain unattached to the typical social fabric of marriage allowed him an unparalleled focus, shielding his groundbreaking work from the distractions and potential pitfalls of a more conventional life, and from the ever-present threat of artistic espionage or politically motivated interference. The secrets of his genius were his own, revealed not in personal alliances, but in the soaring lines of the structures that reshaped the skyline and the very possibilities of architecture. Number 9. John Colet, the Dean, who dreamed of a purer church in a world of indulgence. John Colet, born around 1467 in London, was a man of intense conviction and a leading figure of the English Renaissance. The son of a wealthy merchant who had been Lord Mayor of London multiple times, Colet could have pursued a life of comfortable affluence or political influence. Instead, he chose the path of the church and scholarship, becoming a priest and eventually the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. He was a pivotal figure in Christian humanism, advocating for a return to the original scriptures and a deeper, more personal form of piety. He was a friend of other great humanist thinkers like Erasmus, and his influence on the intellectual and religious climate of early Tudor England was profound. Colet remained celibate throughout his life, a choice consistent with his clerical vows, but also deeply reflective of his personal devotion and his vision for church reform. He poured his considerable inheritance not into personal luxury, but into founding St. Paul's School in 1509, a groundbreaking institution dedicated to providing a humanist education emphasizing classical literature. His dedication to this project was immense, and he meticulously planned its curriculum and governance. A married life, with the attendant responsibilities of family and estate management, would have inevitably diverted resources and attention from his scholarly pursuits and his ambitious educational and reformist goals. The late 15th and early 16th centuries were a period of significant criticism aimed at the church. Clerical corruption, worldliness, and a perceived decline in spiritual devotion were common targets for reformers. Many high-ranking churchmen lived opulent lifestyles, engaged in political maneuvering, and were seen as neglecting their pastoral duties. Pluralism, holding multiple church offices often without residing in the benefices, and simony, the buying and selling of church positions, were widespread practices that led to public discontent and calls for reform. Scandals involving clergy, from financial impropriety to moral lapses, were not uncommon and seriously damaged the church's reputation. For a man like Colet, who passionately advocated for a more devout and ethically upright clergy, entanglement in any form of personal scandal, or even the perception of worldliness that a prominent marriage might bring, could have fatally undermined his moral authority and his reformist message. His own life needed to be an exemplar of the principles he preached. John Colet's sermons were famous for their directness and their often scathing critiques of the shortcomings of the clergy and the laity. He did not shy away from speaking truth to power, even when it was uncomfortable or potentially dangerous. For example, in a convocation sermon in 1512, he openly condemned the avarice, ambition, and secular involvement of bishops and priests. Such outspokenness could attract powerful enemies. A life of unimpeachable personal conduct, including his celibacy, provided him with a stronger platform from which to launch these critiques. It fortified him against accusations of hypocrisy. By choosing a life of scholarly devotion and celibate priesthood, Colet could dedicate himself entirely to his vision of a reformed church and a more enlightened Christian society. His single status amplified his message of spiritual purity and detachment from worldly corruption, allowing him to stand as a more credible and unassailable voice for change in an age desperate for moral leadership within the Church. His legacy, particularly through St. Paul's School, demonstrated a commitment to fostering a new generation grounded in both classical learning and sincere Christian ethics, a commitment perhaps made possible by his singular focus. Number 8. Properzia de Rossi, the sculptor, who carved her own path against a torrent of slander. Properzia de Rossi, born in Bologna around 1490, was a rare figure in the Italian Renaissance, a woman who gained public recognition as a sculptor. In an era when artistic professions were overwhelmingly male domains, Properzia broke barriers, mastering not only drawing and music, but also the physically demanding art of carving marble. She was known for her intricate work, including famously carving miniature scenes on fruit stones, like apricot pits, depicting religious subjects with incredible detail. Her talent eventually led her to receive public commissions, a significant achievement for a woman at that time, including contributing to the sculptural decoration of the facade of San Petronio, Bologna's main basilica. Properzia de Rossi never married. Information about her personal life is somewhat scarce, but the historical accounts, primarily from Giorgio Vasari in his Lives of the Artists, paint a picture of a talented and determined woman who faced considerable obstacles. For a woman in the Renaissance, marriage was the expected path, often defining her social standing and security. Remaining single, especially while pursuing a public career, was an unconventional choice that could leave a woman vulnerable to societal judgment and without the traditional protections a husband and family might offer. Properzia's devotion to her art appears to have been her primary commitment. The life of a female artist in the Renaissance was fraught with potential scandal, not necessarily of her own making, but projected onto her by a society unaccustomed to women in such public and assertive roles. Professional jealousy from male competitors was a significant issue. Vasari recounts that Properzia faced slander and persecution from rival male artists and even from a disgruntled former lover, Amico Aspertini, another painter. These men, perhaps threatened by her skill or resentful of her success, allegedly spread malicious rumors and conspired to undermine her, trying to prevent her from receiving further commissions or fair payment. For a woman, accusations of improper conduct, whether true or false, could be devastating to her reputation and career, far more so than for a man. The scandal for Properzia was often the very act of her succeeding and asserting her talent in the man's world. Her independence and her public visibility made her a target. Vasari suggests that some of Properzia's work, particularly a marble panel depicting Joseph and Potiphar's wife, which he claims represented her unrequited love for a young nobleman, reflected her own emotional turmoil. Whether this interpretation is accurate or a romanticized projection, it highlights how a woman's art and life were scrutinized for personal revelations. By remaining unmarried, Properzia may have sought to maintain her artistic autonomy and avoid the constraints that marriage would inevitably impose on her career. A husband might not have supported her work, or the demands of domestic life could have curtailed her artistic production. However, this singledom did not fully shield her from scandal mongering. Instead, it perhaps made her more of an anomaly, and thus more susceptible to attacks on her character by those who wished to see her fail. Despite these challenges, Properzia persisted, gaining recognition from figures like Pope Clement V, who, according to Vasari, inquired after her during his visit to Bologna in 1530, only to find she had recently died. Her story illustrates the difficult path for a woman artist choosing her craft, where her very ambition and talent combined with her unmarried status could invite scandal from a society struggling to accept her genius. Number 7. Vittoria Colonna, the noblewoman who chose spiritual devotion over remarriage's golden cage. Vittoria Colonna, born in 1490 or 1492 into one of Italy's most powerful noble families, was a celebrated poet and an influential intellectual figure of the Italian Renaissance. Married at a young age to Ferrante Francesco de Vallos, Marquess of Pescara, a prominent military commander. Her early adult life was conventional for a woman of her station. Though marked by her husband's frequent absences due to his military campaigns, it was after his death in battle in 1525 that Vittoria made a series of choices that set her apart. Left a widow in her mid-30s, she was still relatively young, wealthy, and from an influential lineage, making her a desirable candidate for remarriage. Vittoria Colonna chose not to remarry. Instead, she dedicated her life to spiritual pursuits, writing, and intellectual exchange. This was a significant decision in a society where noblewomen, especially widows with assets, were often pressured into new marital alliances for political or dynastic reasons. She spent much of her widowhood in convents, not as a nun taking formal vows, but as a lay resident seeking a contemplative life, first in Rome, then Orvieto, Ischia, and Viterbo. This allowed her a degree of independence and a space to cultivate her intellectual and spiritual interests, which included a deep engagement with the religious reform movements sweeping through Italy at the time. Her poetry, much of which was written during her widowhood, explored themes of love, loss, faith, and spiritual longing, gaining her widespread admiration. For a high-profile noblewoman like Vittoria, remarriage could have been fraught with peril and potential scandal. The Italian political landscape was a treacherous web of shifting alliances, rivalries between powerful families, and foreign interventions. A new marriage would inevitably plunge her back into these power struggles, making her a pawn in dynastic gains. Her first husband, the Marquess of Pescara, had himself been embroiled in complex political maneuvers, including a controversial and ultimately rejected offer to betray the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and become King of Naples. Vittoria had reportedly counseled him against this betrayal. Navigating such a world as a widow was challenging enough. A new marriage would introduce new loyalties, new potential conflicts, and the risk of being tied to a husband whose ambitions or allegiances could lead to disgrace, exile, or worse. Furthermore, any new marriage would bring scrutiny to her character and motivations, especially if it seemed driven by ambition rather than propriety. Her existing status as the respected widow of a war hero afforded her a certain moral high ground. By choosing a life of pious widowhood, Vittoria Colonna carved out a unique space for herself. She became a respected voice in literary and religious circles, corresponding with leading thinkers and artists, including Michelangelo, with whom she shared a profound spiritual friendship. Her homes and the convents where she resided became salons for intellectual discussion. This path allowed her to cultivate her own legacy not as someone's wife, but as a significant poet and a figure of spiritual integrity. Her decision to remain unmarried insulated her from the direct impact of political machinations that a new marriage would have entailed. It allowed her to focus on her writing and her spiritual journey, contributing to the cultural and religious ferment of her time without being yoked to the volatile fortunes of another ambitious nobleman. Her choice was a form of asserting her agency, transforming the traditional role of a widow into a platform for intellectual and spiritual leadership, thereby sidestepping the potential scandals and constraints of a politically charged remarriage. Number 6. Nicolaus Copernicus, the canon, who quietly moved the earth and avoided the storm. Nicolaus Copernicus, or Mikołaj Kopernik, in his native Polish, born in 1473 in Turin, was a true Renaissance man. A mathematician, astronomer, physician, classics, scholar, translator, governor. Yet he is overwhelmingly remembered for one monumental contribution: the heliocentric theory of the universe, which placed the sun rather than the earth at the center. This idea, published in his landmark work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres in the year of his death, 1543, was to fundamentally shift humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. Copernicus never married and lived a life largely dedicated to his administrative duties as a canon in the Warmia Prince Bishopric in Frombork, Poland, and to his private astronomical research. As a canon, he was a church administrator, and while the requirement of celibacy for canons was not as universally strict or enforced at all times and places as for priests with pastoral duties, it was common and expected, especially for someone like Copernicus, who was deeply involved in the church's governance and who had taken minor holy orders. His life was one of diligent service to the church chapter and quiet, patient observation of the heavens. This scholarly and somewhat secluded lifestyle in a relatively remote part of Europe, far from the major centers of power and intellectual upheaval, allowed him the decades of meticulous work required to develop his complex model. The church in the 16th century was a powerful institution, and while it was a patron of learning, it was also wary of ideas that could be seen to challenge established doctrines or its authority. The geocentric model of Ptolemy, with the Earth at the center, had been integrated with Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology for centuries. To suggest otherwise was not merely a scientific disagreement, but could have profound theological implications. While Copernicus's book did not cause an immediate widespread scandal upon its publication, partly due to its dense mathematical nature and a cautious preface added by Andreas Osiander, suggesting it was a useful hypothesis, the potential for it to be deemed heretical was very real, as Galileo would later discover. Personal scandals or accusations of impropriety could have also made Copernicus vulnerable and discredited his work before it even had a chance to be considered. For instance, he had a housekeeper named Anna Schilling from 1528 until 1539, and his bishop, Johannes Dantiscus, pressured him to dismiss her due to concerns about the propriety of their living arrangement, fearing scandal. Copernicus eventually complied, indicating an awareness of the need to maintain an unimpeachable personal reputation. Copernicus was famously cautious about publishing his heliocentric theory, working on it for over 30 years and sharing it only with a few trusted colleagues in manuscript form, long before its official publication. This reluctance stemmed in part from a fear of ridicule from those who would not understand the mathematics, but also likely from an awareness of the potential for conflict with entrenched philosophical and theological views. His life, as a relatively low-profile, dutiful canon, unmarried, and without the complications of a family that might suffer from any controversy he stirred, arguably provided a protective space for his revolutionary work. By maintaining a life of quiet scholarship and avoiding personal entanglements or public confrontations that could attract negative attention, he was able to complete his life's work. His celibacy, or at least his unmarried status and careful management of his household, helped ensure that his personal life did not become a pretext for his intellectual opponents to attack him or his ideas. He chose a path of careful discretion, allowing his revolutionary thoughts to mature in quiet, far from the storms of overt scandal, until they were ready to be presented to the world, albeit at the very end of his life. Number 5 is Isotta Nogarola, the woman scholar who chose books over a world that judged her mind. Isotta Nogarola, born in Verona in 1418 to a noble family, was one of the most famous female humanists of the Italian Renaissance. She, along with her sister Ginevra, received an exceptional classical education, studying Latin, Greek, philosophy, and theology, subjects usually reserved for men. Isotta quickly gained recognition for her learning, engaging in correspondence with prominent male humanists and demonstrating a keen intellect. However, her very public display of erudition as a woman brought her not only admiration but also harsh criticism and social scrutiny in a society that had very rigid ideas about gender roles. Isotta Nogarola never married. After an initial period of public intellectual life which included exchanges of letters that were circulated and discussed, she faced significant backlash. One particularly notorious incident involved an anonymous attack, likely from a male humanist, that slandered her character and questioned her virtue, essentially arguing that a learned woman was an unnatural and promiscuous creature. This public shaming deeply affected Isotta. Around 1441, at the age of 23, she withdrew from the more public humanist circles and moved into her own household, where she lived a life of dedicated study and piety, essentially in scholarly seclusion. For the rest of her life, until her death in 1458, she chose a life of celibacy and intense intellectual pursuit over the conventional paths of marriage or a more socially engaged and vulnerable public life. The scandal for Isotta was not one of typical impropriety, but the scandal of being a woman who dared to be an intellectual equal, or even superior, to men in a field they considered their own. Renaissance humanism, while promoting classical learning, was still largely a patriarchal domain. A woman engaging in public debate, writing scholarly treatises, or displaying her erudition was seen by many as transgressing natural gender boundaries. She could be accused of neglecting her proper female duties, of being arrogant, or as in the attack she suffered, of being morally suspect simply because she was learned and visible. Marriage for Isotta might have meant the end of her scholarly pursuits, as a husband would likely expect her to prioritize domestic duties. It could also have enmeshed her in a life where her intellectual gifts were not valued or were actively suppressed. Public humiliation she endured demonstrated the risks of being an intellectual woman in the public eye. Any perceived slip, or even just her existence, could be twisted into a scandal. By retreating into a more private, studious existence, Isotta Nogarola found a way to continue her intellectual work on her own terms, shielded from the most vicious public attacks. In this self-imposed seclusion, she produced her most significant works, including a famous dialogue on the relative sin of Adam and Eve, where she argued for the greater responsibility of Adam, a bold theological stance. Her choice to remain unmarried and live a life of devout scholarship was a way of creating a protected space for her intellect to flourish. It was a strategy to navigate a world that was not ready for a woman of her intellectual caliber. While she did not entirely escape criticism, her withdrawal to a life of piety and study made her a less accessible target for public slander and allowed her to build a legacy as a serious scholar and a woman of virtue. Her singledom was a key component of this strategy, freeing her from marital obligations and the societal expectations that came with being a wife, thus allowing her to pursue the life of the mind that she so clearly craved, even if it meant a degree of isolation from the wider world that had judged her so harshly. Number 4. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the scholar-monk who fought corruption from the Sidelines of celibacy. Desiderius Erasmus, born in Rotterdam around 1466, was one of the most influential scholars of the Northern Renaissance, a towering figure of Christian humanism. He was an ordained priest, having joined an Augustinian monastery in his youth, but he lived much of his adult life as an independent scholar, traveling across Europe, writing, teaching, and corresponding with the leading thinkers, reformers, and patrons of his age. His works, including a new Latin and Greek edition of the New Testament, The Praise of Folly, and Handbook of a Christian Knight, were immensely popular and promoted a vision of Christianity focused on inner piety, morality, and the study of Scripture, often criticizing the abuses and superstitions he saw within the Church. Erasmus remained celibate throughout his life, consistent with his priestly vows, although he found monastic life itself stifling and eventually obtained dispensations to live and work outside the cloister. His illegitimacy, he was the son of a priest and a physician's daughter, was a sensitive issue for him throughout his life and perhaps contributed to his somewhat detached and independent stance. He never sought high church office for himself, preferring the freedom of a scholar. Marriage was, of course, not an option for him as a priest, but his commitment to a life of dedicated scholarship effectively functioned as a form of chosen singledom brahmatizing, intellectual and spiri. The church in Erasmus's time was indeed a hotbed of potential and actual scandal. The immense wealth and political power of the papacy and high clergy, the sale of indulgences, which became a key trigger for the Reformation, simony, nepotism, clerical ignorance, and the often luxurious and immoral lifestyles of some priests and monks were all subjects of widespread criticism, which Erasmus himself articulated with sharp wit and profound concern in his writings. For someone like Erasmus, who aimed to reform the church from within through education and a return to scriptural sources, maintaining an unimpeachable personal reputation was crucial. Any hint of personal scandal, financial impropriety, moral lapse, or even excessive ambition for worldly power would have severely damaged his credibility as a critic and a reformer. His dedication to a simple scholarly life, unencumbered by the pursuit of wealth or ecclesiastical preferment, lent weight to his critiques. Erasmus navigated a precarious path during the early years of the Protestant Reformation. While critical of church abuses, he never broke with the Catholic Church, hoping for reform rather than schism. His moderate stance earned him criticism from both staunch Catholics, who sometimes suspected him of Lutheran sympathies, and from radical reformers, who felt he did not go far enough. His celibacy and scholarly detachment helped him maintain a degree of neutrality and intellectual independence. It allowed him to correspond with figures on all sides of the burgeoning religious divide without being easily co-opted or discredited by association with a particular faction's less savory aspects or political maneuverings. By choosing a life of an itinerant celibate scholar, Erasmus was able to dedicate his immense intellectual energies to his project of fostering a more enlightened and ethical Christianity. His personal life, marked by its simplicity and devotion to learning, stood in stark contrast to the corruption he often criticized, reinforcing the moral authority of his influential voice during one of Christianity's most turbulent periods. His chosen path kept him free from the types of personal and political scandals that ensnared many churchmen of his era. Number 3. Michelangelo Buonarroti, the divine artist who wrestled with faith, art, and solitude. Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni, born in 1475 in Caprice, was a colossus of the High Renaissance, a sculptor, painter, architect, and poet, whose works like the statue of David, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and the dome of St. Peter's beseements in human history. He was often described as Il Divino, the Divine One, for his breathtaking skill. Yet his life was one of intense, often tormented creativity, deep religious conviction, and a famously solitary and frugal disposition. Michelangelo never married and had no known children. He lived a life largely absorbed by his monumental artistic commissions, often working under immense pressure from powerful patrons like popes and the Medici family. His contemporaries noted his ascetic lifestyle. He was often described as living poorly, indifferent to comfort, and wholly dedicated to his art. While marriage was the norm, Michelangelo seems to have viewed it as a distraction from his work, or perhaps incompatible with his temperament and the all-consuming nature of his genius. He once reportedly said that his art was his wife, and his works were his children, providing him with enough trouble. This profound dedication to his craft left little room for the demands of a conventional family life. The Renaissance world, particularly in the high echelons of church and state where Michelangelo moved, was not without its moral complexities and potential for scandal. Michelangelo himself, with his fiery temperament and uncompromising artistic vision, often found himself in conflict with his patrons. Beyond professional disputes, however, was the nature of his intense emotional life, which found expression in his poetry. He wrote passionate sonnets and poems addressed to young men, most notably Tommaso de Cavalieri and also to the poet Vittoria Colonna. These relationships were deeply spiritual and intellectual, but the language of his poetry, particularly to Cavalieri, was homoerotic in its expression, reflecting the Neoplatonic ideals of beauty and love, but also potentially open to misinterpretation in an era where sodomy was condemned as a sin and a crime. Accusations or even strong rumors of such relationships, if they became public scandal, could have had severe repercussions for his career and reputation, especially given his work for the church. While there is no definitive proof of physical relationships, the intensity of his written affections, combined with his unmarried status, made his personal life a subject of speculation even then. Michelangelo's choice to remain unmarried and live a relatively isolated life, focused on his art and his increasingly deep Catholic faith, can be seen as a way of navigating these personal and societal pressures. His solitary existence might have been a shield, protecting his private emotional world and allowing him to channel his immense energies into his work, without the complications or potential exposures of a more conventional domestic life. He was notoriously guarded and private. His intense religiosity, especially in his later years as reflected in his poetry and his late works like the Rondinini Pietà, suggests a man grappling with profound spiritual questions and seeking salvation. Public scandal related to his personal affections could have been devastating not only to his social standing, but also to his spiritual peace, and his legacy as an artist deeply engaged with Christian themes. By dedicating himself so completely to his art, and by cultivating a persona of the solitary, divinely inspired artist, Michelangelo largely avoided the kind of personal scandals that could have tarnished his name or derailed his monumental contributions to Western art, leaving behind a legacy of unparalleled creative power. Number 2. Leonardo da Vinci, the universal genius, whose secrets were best kept in solitude. Leonardo da Vinci, born in 1452 in Vinci, Italy, was the quintessential Renaissance man. His genius spanned an astonishing range of fields. He was a painter of sublime masterpieces like the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, a brilliant sculptor, a visionary architect, a pioneering anatomist and engineer, inventor, cartographer, geologist, musician, and botanist. His notebooks are filled with intricate drawings and far-sighted ideas, from flying machines to armored vehicles. Yet, despite his fame and his engagement with some of the most powerful courts in Europe, Leonardo lived a remarkably private personal life. Leonardo da Vinci never married and is not known to have had any intimate relationships with women. He surrounded himself with young male apprentices and companions, most notably Salai and Francesco Melzi, who inherited his notebooks and estate. This lifelong bachelorhood was unusual for a man of his prominence in Renaissance society, where marriage and family were central to social structure and legacy. Leonardo's energies were overwhelmingly poured into his art and his relentless scientific inquiries. His curiosity was boundless, and his notebooks attest to a mind constantly observing, questioning, and inventing, a pursuit that seemed to leave little space or inclination for conventional domestic life. The shadow of potential scandal touched Leonardo early in his career. In 1476, when he was 24 and working in Florence in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, he was anonymously accused of sodomy involving a 17-year-old artist's model, Jacopo Saltarelli. Several other young men, including one from the prominent Tornabuoni family, were also implicated. Sodomy was illegal in Florence and punishable by hefty fines, public humiliation, and even death, although prosecutions were inconsistent. Leonardo and the others were twice investigated and ultimately acquitted, likely due to lack of evidence, or perhaps influential protection. However, such an accusation, even if dismissed, could have been devastating to a young artist's career and reputation. This experience may have instilled in Leonardo a profound caution regarding his personal life and public conduct. The nature of his relationships with his male pupils, particularly Sali, who entered his household at age 10 and stayed for decades, has been the subject of much speculations, is lacking. However, the perception or rumor of such relationships in that era could easily fuel scandal. Leonardo's choice to remain unmarried and to lead a life that was intensely focused on his work, often moving between patrons and cities, can be interpreted as a way of maintaining his freedom and protecting himself from further scrutiny or entanglement. His scientific pursuits, particularly his anatomical studies involving human dissection, were also pushing boundaries and could have attracted condemnation from the church or secular authorities, if not handled with discretion. He was known for being somewhat secretive about his methods and discoveries. A wife and family might have constrained his movements, his unconventional working hours, and his ability to pursue such a wide array of potentially controversial interests. His singular devotion to his art and science and his carefully guarded private life allowed him to navigate the complex social and political currents of his time without being fatally compromised by personal scandal. This focused, unattached existence enabled him to produce an extraordinary body of work that continued to inspire awe and wonder, while his deepest personal thoughts and relationships remained largely enigmatic, shielded from a world that might not have understood or accepted them. Number 1. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, who married a nation to dodge 1,000 dangers. Elizabeth Tudor, born in 1533, ascended to the English throne in 1558, inheriting a kingdom fractured by religious turmoil, economic instability, and complex foreign relations. Her very legitimacy had been questioned, born as she was from Henry VIII's controversial marriage to Anne Boleyn, who was later executed. Elizabeth's early life was marked by uncertainty and danger. She was even imprisoned in the Tower of London by her half-sister, Queen Mary I. When she became queen, the pressure to marry and produce an heir was immense, both from her counselors and from foreign powers. Queen Elizabeth I famously never married, cultivating the image of the Virgin Queen, wedded to her kingdom and people. Throughout her long reign of 44 years, she entertained a string of suitors, both foreign princes and English noblemen. These included King Philip of Spain, her former brother-in-law, various French royal sons like the Duke of Anjou, archdukes from the Austrian Habsburg dynasty, King Eric Ziv of Sweden, and English contenders like Sir William Pickering and, most notably, her childhood friend Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Each potential match was a political minefield. The scandals Elizabeth astutely sidestepped by remaining single were numerous and potentially catastrophic for England. Marrying a foreign Catholic prince like Philip or a French Valois could have reignited the brutal religious conflicts that had scarred England under Mary I, potentially leading to civil war or making England a subordinate state to a continental power. English populace was largely wary of foreign Catholic influence. Marrying a foreign Protestant prince might have drawn England into costly and dangerous European wars, depleting its resources and threatening its security. On the other hand, marrying an English nobleman, such as Robert Dudley, presented its own set of perils. It would have undoubtedly inflamed jealousies and factionalism among the powerful English aristocracy, potentially leading to plots and rebellions. The scandals surrounding the mysterious death of Dudley's first wife, Amy Robsart, in 1560, cast a dark shadow over him. If Elizabeth had married Dudley, especially at that time, it could have been interpreted as her condoning or even being complicit in a scandalous crime, severely damaging her moral authority and her hold on the crown. Elizabeth masterfully used her unmarried status as a diplomatic tool, keeping various suitors and their nations hopeful, playing them off against each other to England's advantage. She bought precious time for England to stabilize and strengthen. Her counselors repeatedly urged her to marry to secure the succession, as the lack of a direct heir created uncertainty and opened the door for potential claimants like Mary, Queen of Scots, who became a focal point for Catholic plots against Elizabeth. However, Elizabeth seemed acutely aware that any marriage choice could create more problems than it solved. Her father Henry VI's marriages, with their attendant political upheavals, executions, and religious schism, provided a stark lesson in the dangers of royal matrimony. Elizabeth's personal experiences, including the execution of her mother and the near disaster of her youthful flirtation with Thomas Seymour, who married her stepmother Catherine Parr and whose ambitions led to his execution, likely made her deeply wary of marriage. By choosing to remain the Virgin Queen, she transformed what many saw as a weakness into a powerful symbol of her dedication to England, fostering a cult of personality that inspired loyalty and national unity. Her decision, while perhaps born of a complex mix of personal inclination and shrewd political calculation, successfully navigated England through a period of immense vulnerability, avoiding the dynastic squabbles, foreign entanglements, and internal divisions that a politically charged marriage could easily have unleashed. She chose sovereignty and stability for her realm over the perilous path of royal wedlock.